Coming up on Mountain News at 5:30, new details about the manhunt for the mass shooting suspect in Maine. Plus, lawmakers faced a long list of legislative work to resolve and tight deadlines, including the threat of a government shutdown next month.
And we are mild this evening, but a major cool down is on the way. Those details coming up as Mountain News at 5:30 starts now.
Dedicated to Southern and Eastern Kentucky, this is WYMT Mountain News at 5:30.
Good evening, I'm Steve Hensley. A manhunt continues for the gunman involved in yesterday's mass shooting in Maine. At least 18 people were killed and 13 others injured after the suspect opened fire inside a bowling alley and a restaurant in the state's second largest city. The suspect is facing 8 counts of murder so far, pending the identification of other victims. CBS's Bradley Blackburn reports from Lewiston, Maine.
Authorities in Maine are urging residents to shelter in place as they hunt for the gunman believed to be responsible for Wednesday's deadly mass shooting.
He should be considered armed and dangerous. Based on our investigation, we believe this is someone that should not be approached.
We have an active shooter. We have multiple injuries.
Officials say 40-year-old Robert Card, seen here in surveillance photos, opened fire inside a Lewiston bowling alley that hosts a children's bowling league.
Out of nowhere, he just came in and there was a loud pop. Thought it was a balloon.
About 10 minutes later, police believe the U.S. Army reservist fired at patrons inside a restaurant 4 miles away. A vehicle belonging to the suspect was found shortly before midnight in a nearby town.
You and me and all these people standing here, we all got to fear for our lives today.
Homicides here in Maine's second largest city are rare. The state itself has long been considered one of the safest in the nation.
This city did not deserve this terrible assault on its citizens, on its peace of mind, on its sense of security. No city does.
A New York National Guard spokesperson says Card was taken to a hospital for a medical evaluation in July after acting erratically during training at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. As the investigation continues, President Biden has ordered flags to be flown at half-staff nationwide in honor of the victims. Bradley Blackburn, CBS News, Lewiston, Maine.
The shooting in Maine was the 36th mass killing in the U.S. so far this year. Attorney General Merrick Garland says the FBI, ATF, and U.S. Marshals are all on the ground to provide investigative support to local law enforcement. While the tragedy in Maine happened hundreds of miles away from the bluegrass, it hits very close to home for one Central Kentucky sports editor. Cal Oaks is the sports editor for the Georgetown News Graphic. But before he came to Georgetown, he spent more than 20 years in Lewiston, Maine, the center of yesterday's deadly mass shooting.
I'm fairly certain I will know somebody in some way that was a victim of this.
As he anxiously awaits more information about what happened, Oates hopes people recognize that area and its people for more than its worst moment. 5 people are dead after a shooting late yesterday inside a home in rural North Carolina. The Sampson County Sheriff's Office called the scene unusual. Investigators are not sure how the 4 men and 1 woman are related. They are of different races and ethnicities, with ages ranging from their 30s to 80s. It's also unclear how the man who called 911 knows them.
We are tracking some dry and mild weather across the mountains into your Thursday evening. Here's a live look across the mountains from Pikeville to Hazard, also over to London. We are dry, also partly sunny, and those temperatures are once again above average on your Thursday. Most of us in the middle to upper 70s right now, 76 in Jackson, also Pikeville, 75 in Hazard, and 77 for Manchester, also Harlan and Jonesville at this hour. So once again, we are above average as that mild weather does continue. Up on the radar, we are dry, all thanks to high pressure, and this strong area of high pressure will continue into this evening, also into tonight and for the first half of your Friday, but we are watching out for some changes as early as tomorrow. This evening, though, if you have any plans, we stay dry, also partly cloudy, and those lows not as cool as you wake up on Friday thanks to those clouds back in the lower 60s as you wake up and walk out the door. More warm weather on the way by Friday, but some chilly weather on the way by Halloween of next week. How about those 30s, Steve? More details on that that coming up in just a few minutes.
All right, Cameron, thank you very much. Now to the UAW strike. Workers at Ford's Kentucky truck plant in Louisville could head back to work next week. Yesterday, the union and Ford agreed to a tentative agreement that is expected to end the union's ongoing strike with the company. The 4-year deal still needs to be approved by 57,000 union members. It would give top-scale assembly plant workers a 25% raise during the life of the contract. In the more than 3 weeks that it took for the House of Representatives to find a new speaker, time has been running out for Congress to get critical pieces of legislation passed. Now Speaker Mike Johnson has to get to work in what's been shown to be a very divided chamber. CBS's Natalie Brand has more from Capitol Hill.
On his first full day on the job, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson had a new crisis to address, a mass shooting in Maine.
This is a dark time in America. We have a lot of problems, and we're really, really hopeful and prayerful. Prayer is appropriate in a time like this, that the evil can end and this senseless violence can stop.
Democrats renewed calls for legislation on gun violence, but say they're not hopeful.
It will be difficult given the far-right extremist speaker who's just been chosen in the House. And so I'm determined that we will make the effort.
Lawmakers face a long list of legislative work to resolve and tight deadlines, including the threat of a government shutdown next month.
Like it or not, Speaker Johnson will not be able to ignore the need for bipartisanship in divided government.
A bipartisan group of lawmakers, including the new speaker, met with President Biden at the White House Thursday to discuss his proposed bill to spend more than $100 billion on Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and border security.
President Putin is not giving up on his aspirations to take all of Ukraine. And as long as Russia continues its brutal assault, we have to continue to support the Ukrainian people in their self-defense.
But there is growing opposition to additional Ukraine funding by some House Republicans who are calling for a separate vote on the issue. Natalie Brand, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
Speaker Johnson wants Congress to pass all 12 funding bills to keep the government open, but he acknowledges a short-term spending bill may be needed, something conservatives in the House have previously opposed. Strong consumer spending boosted the U.S. economy in the third quarter, with the Commerce Department reporting GDP growth of nearly 5%, much higher than economists expected. The robust growth in the economy came despite high interest rates now at a 22-year high and inflation holding steady at 3.7%. In a statement, President Biden touted the strong GDP numbers, saying it is a testament to the resilience of American consumers and American workers.
Congressional Republicans, the prior administration, really focused on tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans and the largest corporations as their single most important economic policy. I think as that contrast becomes clearer to the American people, you might start to see some improvement in those numbers.
Unemployment has been less than 4% for more than a year and a half, and real wages are up within the last year. Representative Jamal Bowman has pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor for falsely triggering a fire alarm in a House office building. The Democrat from New York was caught on tape pulling the alarm in late September, shortly before the House was scheduled to vote on a government funding bill. He said he accidentally pulled the alarm while trying to get to the vote, thinking it would open a door that was closed. The Senate has approved an amendment that would make it easier for veterans with mental illness to bypass background checks when buying weapons. The measure is attached to a package of annual spending bills that has not passed the Senate yet, but could next week. 3 Democrats joined Republicans in supporting the amendment, as did independent Senators Angus King and Kyrsten Sinema, who caucus with Democrats. President Biden's request for $106 billion for national security funding is getting some pushback from some Senate Republicans. The president's request to Congress includes funding for the wars in Israel, Ukraine, as well as for the defense of Taiwan and the southern U.S. border. Senators like Missouri's Eric Schmidt are calling for the measures to not be looped together.
I think these bills ought to be considered separately. The situation in Israel Ukraine and the other scenarios are different, and they ought to be treated as such. There's different realities on the ground, there's different objectives, there's different likelihoods of success, there's different political support, and I just don't support the idea of lumping all this together.
Some Republicans feel differently, though, including Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who said he supports packaging Ukraine and Israel aid, saying he views it all as interconnected. Israel briefly sent troops into Gaza in preparation for the next stage in its bloody conflict with Hamas. CBS's Tina Kraus reports from Tel Aviv about the growing crisis on both sides of the border.
Israel released video of its tanks entering Gaza overnight and striking Hamas targets. The military says the raid was to prepare the battlefield before an expected ground invasion to root out terrorists. In the meantime, the airstrikes continue. Ambulances raced through Gaza after Israel said it carried out about 250 strikes in the last day. The military says it's targeting Hamas infrastructure, but a growing number of civilians are caught in the crossfire, and hospitals are struggling to treat the injured while running low on fuel and supplies. While the conflict rages, protesters gathered in Tel Aviv to keep the focus on about 220 hostages held by Hamas since its October 7th rampage into Israel.
I want my brother back now. I want him safe. I want to make sure that he's taken care of. I want to know what his condition.
As Israel continues its airstrikes on Gaza, Hamas is returning fire. Militants have launched thousands of rockets over the border, keeping residents on edge. This woman had stopped to talk with us when the sirens sounded the alarm. Her two sons are Israeli soldiers at the Gaza border. She says she's both scared and proud.
Well, I'm very proud because they're good boys. They want just to live and to love. They don't want war.
Israel is also positioned to defend its northern border with Lebanon, but the Israeli defense minister says its war is only with Hamas and that the ground invasion will begin when conditions are right. Tina Kraus, CBS News, Tel Aviv.
The Gulf nation Qatar has been helping with negotiations to release the hostages. So far, only 4 civilians have been freed. Coming up on Mountain News at 5:30, do you have a credit card you're struggling to pay off? A money expert talks about the pros and cons of a balance transfer.
Plus, after dry weather for most of this week, we are tracking some beneficial rain chances by next week. Those details coming up.